Hi, I'm Ben Orford and this is the knife making workshop, and what we're going to show you this time is how to restore the cutting edge of an axe. So we've had a few people ask what do you do if you've hit any bits of metal in old fence posts, or if you've stuck the axe in the ground and you've hit a few rocks and you've got a few nicks in there. Now obviously you might not have mechanical means, you might not have grinders and things, and you'd have to do it by hand, but a few of you have actually asked how I'd go about doing it. And obviously in the workshop we've got access to lots of grinders and mechanical means, so we're going to show you how we go about doing that. Now obviously we've got lots of these belt grinders or linishers. A lot of you might not have access to things as big or as powerful as these, but there are small belt sanders available on the market which will do just as good a job really. The only thing I will say is avoid using any high-speed bench grinders that have got a solid stone wheel. You'll find that you'll more likely generate a lot of heat. The steel will get a lot of heat into it, and you're likely to soften the steel and lose the temper. So try and avoid high-speed grinding wheels and only use some form of abrasive, some sandpaper. Now we're using this kind of abrasive, which is the next sort of generation of abrasive. So rather than using aluminium oxide, this is actually ceramic, so it's much sharper, it generates less heat in the actual steel, and it makes a much better job because it lasts longer. So that's what I'm using there. So they run a little bit more expensive, but it's worth it in the long run. Now when I'm grinding, I try not to use the solid wheel. I'm actually going to use the unsupported section of the belt. Now it'll make a bit more sense when we actually start grinding, but effectively by using this soft section of belt, the belt will actually distort to the convex grind that we want to try and produce on this axe. So that's where I'm going to be doing most of my grinding. Now we're actually going to be running the belt away from ourselves so that there's no danger of the axe actually cutting into the abrasive belt itself. So if you haven't got a grinder that you can change the direction on, then what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to position the grinder so that it's running away from you. So you'll have to play around with it a little bit. Now I don't tend to wear gloves on my hands when I'm grinding because I want to make sure that I can feel if the axe starts to get warm, and I've got a little bucket of water handy so I can just dip the axe head every now and again and make sure that stays nice and cool. Now the other thing that I would definitely recommend that you wear, no matter how sort of uncool they look, is some really good goggles. Now these seal all the way around the top and the bottom because we don't want any of those hot sparks going in our eyes. So we'll pop those on now, and we'll turn this grinder on. Now I've got the advantage of being able to control the speed on this as well, so you might not be able to do that on yours, but so long as you keep bare hands and take it nice and steady and make sure you use nice fresh sharp abrasive, you'll be okay. So we'll turn this grinder on. We'll just check the tracking to make sure that it's not off the wheel too much, and then we'll position ourselves behind the abrasive belt so the belt's going away from us, and we're going to start by placing the axe on there and start to grind this backside the bevel. So I'm not applying too much pressure to start with, and you can probably see how the belt actually distorts to that convex shape that we want. Now after a few passes we just want to stop and have a look, and you can see that we're hitting the back edge of that bevel and it's starting to bend right round to almost to the cutting edge. So there's still a little section there that I haven't ground. Now depending on how much damage that you've actually got on your axe, like this hasn't got too much damage, it's only got a little nick there on the very tip there. Like if there's lots of nicks or lots of steel to remove, then you want to start off with quite a heavy grit. This is actually 80 grit, which is still removing the steel quite quickly, but if you've got big nicks you might want to start with something like maybe even a P40 grit or even a P60. But think that the coarser the grit you start with, the finer and finer you'll have to go to get rid of those heavy marks. So we'll just do a little bit more on this side. And I sort of lift this backhand slightly just so that it sort of creates that nice convex shape. And after a few passes I can start to see that I produce a burr on this side, so that means that I've actually got to the cutting edge of that section. What I try and do is look for that burr to be an equal shape and an equal size all the way along. So, and I also want to keep going until I get rid of that little bit of damage as well. So I've pretty much got a burr all the way along now. So what I'll do is I'll try and replicate the same grind on the other side. Now you might find that it's difficult to do one side. Make sure you've got plenty of clearance and the handle's not going to knock into anything. But we'll try and produce the same grind on this side. So I'm just keeping my eyes peeled for that burr to start to hook over onto this side of the bevel. And I also want to stop every now and again and make sure that I can still hold it with my hands. That's not even warm yet. And I also use the light that I've got here to try and look to make sure that I've got rid of those bits of nick and damage that are along the cutting edge. So I've pretty much worked all the way along that bevel. I'm just going to take a bit more off that back edge to try and keep them symmetrical. And we also want to make sure that we don't grind into the side of our axe. So make sure that you get the angle just about right. So once we've done that first pass, that initial grind with the coarse grit, just check the cutting edge, and we've got that burr pretty much all the way along the face now. So what I'll do is I'll change the grit, and I normally drop down from an 80 grit, I'll probably drop down to a 180 grit, something like that, and start to take some of those deep scratches out. So we've changed the grit over, we've gone from the 80 grit now to a P180 grit, so this is much finer. And what we're going to do, we'll get the grinder running, we're going to basically reproduce those same actions that we did with the coarse grit. This time we're not applying as much pressure because we're not trying to remove any amount of steel, we're just trying to polish out those scratches. And you'll probably hear that it's a much quieter sound now because it's a much finer belt. So that's polished that side quite nicely, and then I'll do exactly the same on the other side of the axe. And I can really see that burr now. So you might want to just do a couple of light passes on one side and then the other. And then what we'll do is we'll stop the grinder and we'll swap this over to the next grit, which is probably the last grit that I'll use actually. I'll probably go down to a P320. So I'll slide that over and tighten that up. And we'll do exactly the same process again. So much steadier now with the finest grit, the 320 grit. And much quieter than all the other abrasives that we've used, and we're just polishing out those scratches, and we can start to see that last little burr hooking from one side to the other. So we try and alternate, easing off the pressure. We're almost just using the weight of the axe alone. That's great. And then what we'll do is it's up to you. You could go finer, or you could even just take that last little bit of burr off with a fine sharpening stone or a bit of sandpaper stuck to a board, but what I personally like to use is just the leather strop with some polishing compound on. So my strop is a piece of leather stuck to a board, and then I've charged the surface of the leather with some honing paste, some Tormek paste, and then what I'm going to do is apply some pressure, quite hard to start with, making sure that you go away from the cutting edge, and then alternate the sides. And what this is doing is it's polishing that last bit of bevel, and it's wiping that burr back and forth both sides until it finally just fatigues and comes off. Now this puts a really nice polished edge on there and gets rid of any of those little bits of metal fibre that are still hanging on. Now once you've had a few passes, get the axe under the light again and make sure you've got rid of all that burr. Now if you look at it and you see that there's still a little nick in there, you might want to just change the grit, go slightly coarser, and then repeat the process until you've got rid of all that damage. So once you're happy, you can always give it a little test with the paper. Make sure that you've got it really nice and sharp, And just in case you've got it wet when you've been sharpening, you might want to just put a bit of gun oil, a bit of camellia oil on there just to protect your axe. So that's pretty much how I go about it. Obviously I've got access to these grinders, but so long as you make sure you use a sander rather than a high-speed grinder, and make sure you use a nice fresh grit, and make sure you got your goggles on, that's the way you can go about it. So I hope that's helpful, and if you like what you see, then you can subscribe to our channel.